Bibliophiles of the internet, I recently read 4 highly anticipated queer novellas, and I'm here to share my findings and my thoughts. First, as a quick note, all of these novellas do happen to come from various Macmillan imprints. I was gifted review copies for all of them in different formats, and I just want to be very upfront about that. And I also want to make it very clear that this video is not sponsored in any way, shape, or form. All of these thoughts are my own. I decided to put these books together in one video on my own. Tor and Tor.com just happen to have the corner in the market when it comes to traditionally published short works. With that said, the first novella I'm going to be talking about is What Stalks the Deep by T. Kingfisher. I was granted early access to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is once again read by the incomparable Avi Roque, and this comes out on September 30th from Tor Nightfire. This is the third installment in a series of horror novellas, though I would say each installment is very much self-contained and can be read on its own, although I would definitely recommend the entire series. The series follows a retired non-binary soldier named Alex Easton who uses Ka-Kan pronouns. In this story, Alex's old friend Dr. Denton summons Alex to an abandoned coal mine in West Virginia, where Denton's cousin has vanished without a trace. Content warnings for brief mentions of war and experiences of war-related PTSD, references to animal death and graphic animal attacks, some depictions of violence, instances of misgendering with character consent, and some depictions of claustrophobia and panic. It's worth noting, as I said, that Alex is AFAB non-binary, uses Ka-Kan pronouns, and has tinnitus. If you've been here with me for a while, you know that I've been a huge fan of this series ever since the first book came out in 2022. I really love what T. Kingfisher has created here in the sense that she's imagined this really compelling character who continues to face down horrifying, inexplicable things and processes them with a tongue-in-cheek sense of humor and an unexpected sort of lightness. In a nutshell, I think that's what T. Kingfisher does so brilliantly across all of her books. She's able to walk that very fine line between darkness and lightness. She's able to counterbalance really horrific imagery and concepts with unexpected humor and heart. And in that respect, this novella is exactly in line with everything she does best. Related to that, I love Avi Roque's performance in this audiobook. I think this is definitely them at their best because they have the kind of emotional range and tonal range that a story like this really needs. And they're able to oscillate between extremes so seamlessly and provide the kind of highly personable narration that perfectly suits a story like this. I also think that T. Kingfisher consistently delivers on atmosphere and aesthetic in each of these novellas in this series. The way she maps out this abandoned mine and shows the characters moving through it feels so oppressively claustrophobic, and she's able to tap into that feeling of being cut off from the world in so many ways. And I found it really interesting to see how Kingfisher is able to blend realism in regards to the science of mining and caves with this more outlandish, fantastical take on the sorts of monsters that might be lurking in the darkness. T. Kingfisher is definitely on her A-game in regards to how she puts her bizarre little imagination to work, because you could have given me an entire calendar year to guess what these characters were up against down in these mines, and I never would have come even remotely close. I really respect that. I love when horror stories are able to surprise and actually astonish the audience. I appreciate when horror is able to subvert or even sidestep the tried and true cliches we've come to expect from the genre, and that's definitely what this story does. Thematically, this series continues to be especially compelling when you think about Alex's experiences as a soldier, which have been traumatizing for Khan in more ways than one, and how that has prepared Alex in some ways to face down these horrific, terrifying things, and more importantly, to be able to carry on after the fact. There's also a lot in here about the experience of toxic masculinity, which is especially interesting considering that Alex is AFAB non-binary, but also passes as a man in some situations. The male characters in this story are prone to posturing, to deflecting, to avoiding any expression of fear or even hesitation because they don't want to be seen as weak. Alex occasionally falls into that trap as well, and it's interesting to see how the characters are sort of renegotiating their masculinity as the story progresses, because they realize that they can't even come close to the truth of what's happening in this mine if they don't actually acknowledge what it is they're feeling and experiencing first. So all in all, this was an incredibly compelling third installment in what's been a very strong series so far. Especially considering where this story leaves off, I think it's safe to say we can definitely expect more adventures with Alex Easton, and I honestly cannot wait. I do think the story loses some narrative tension and a sense of urgency after the big reveal, especially considering how much story is left afterwards, but I would still give this 4.5 stars. The next novella I listened to was Spread Me by Sarah Gailey, once again gifted to me courtesy of Macmillan Audio. The audiobook is read by Xe Sands, and this recently came out on September 23rd, also from Tor Nightfire. This novella is a fascinating blend of of horror, sci-fi, and erotica. It's about a scientist named Kinsey who's leading a research project at a remote desert outpost. One day, her team discovers a very mysterious specimen, and even though it's breaking quarantine protocols, they don't want to lose this specimen in the oncoming sandstorm, so they bring it into their laboratory against their better judgment. It doesn't take long for the team to realize that this specimen is spreading some kind of contagious disease, and this dangerous, possibly sentient virus is desperately searching for a new host. Content warnings for descriptions of illness and vomit, some references to suicide and suicide ideation, some depictions of sexual assault, and some explicit sexual content. Listen, this was wild. Believe it or not, this was my first time reading from Sarah Gailey, even though many of their books have been on my long-term TBR for quite some time. And what an introduction this was. I love weird-ass stories like this that really dig deep and push the boundaries of what queerness is, what it can be, and what it can look like. So often, I would say too often, people limit what queerness is to attraction or romance or relationship configuration when it's actually so much more expansive. Queerness is a transgressive way of connecting with not only other people and ourselves, but it's also a verb in the sense of queering the ways that we connect with and move through the world itself. I feel like that's really the heart of this story. It's asking really interesting questions about what desire can look like. It posits the concept of desire as infectious disease, as a sentient, unstoppable force that hungers for us back. It explores queerness as something that goes beyond physicality, beyond the human vessel itself, and I find that deeply, deeply fascinating. It's a very weird story, it's challenging, it's darkly seductive, and I appreciate the story for taking those narrative risks, and also for playing with the locked room, quarantine turned deadly tropes in really interesting and compelling ways. I think this is also a story about what it means to know yourself, to truly know yourself, and to become comfortable with the parts of yourself that might be seen as undesirable or that might not be easy to love. What does it mean to accept the dark, twisted, deeply fucked up parts of yourself? And at what point does hiding those parts of yourself come at too high a cost? A lot of the horror elements and fear in this story come from Kinsey desperately fighting to keep what she knows about this virus a secret, because if she shares her suspicions with her teammates, it would be incredibly vulnerable for her, and it might forever change the way they see her, which is not something that she's willing to risk. She's basically run the calculus and decided that this mask of civility or palatability is worth more than her teammates' lives. So again, it's asking that question of what it means to expose the truth of ourselves to the people around us, even when that truth is not palatable or easy to understand, especially in a world where it's so easy and so tempting to isolate ourselves and to risk nothing. While I did find myself wanting more from the world building of the story, from the background of this research project and what exactly binds all these characters to it, and even wanting to know more about what this team was studying to begin with, I still thought this was incredibly solid and I deeply appreciate its project, so I gave it 4.25 stars. After that, I picked up Fate's Bane by C.L. Clarke. This comes out on September 30th from Tor.com. This is a sapphic fantasy story about a young girl named Agnir who comes from a culture where there used to be one united clan that eventually splintered off into many different clans that are now often at odds. As a child, she was actually taken hostage by an enemy clan and adopted as a ward of that clan in order to ensure that her birth clan doesn't attempt to scale any kind of attack, and therefore ensures a tenuous peace. So she's taken in by this enemy clan, raised in their ways as one of their own, and she finds herself falling for the chieftain's daughter more and more as time passes. And the two of them stumble upon this hidden magical spring that awakens a sort of magic within them that could either bind their clans together at last or completely destroy any chance of peace. Content warnings for references to kidnapping and enslavement, some depictions of physical punishment and abuse, brief references to deadly illness, some depictions of death, brief allusions to sexual harassment and assault, depictions of war, violence, and graphic injury, and some fade to black sexual content. This was also my first time reading from C.L. Clarke, even though much like Sarah Gailey, I have several of their books on my TBR, and honestly, this novella makes me want to bump those up a little bit further on my list. I would say don't go into this expecting a sapphic romance. I wouldn't say this story fits into how we define and classify a romance. It's definitely more of a tragedy. It's about these two characters who burn for each other and hurt because of each other. There's yearning, there's angst, there's heartbreak, and the story is more focused on the implications of this romantic relationship as opposed to resolving that relationship in a way that feels good, much less in a way that's actually clear-cut. I would say the story is very much about crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. It really sits in that uncomfortable in-between in-between space, that gray area, and rather than deflecting or romanticizing being at those crossroads, it actually draws the eye to those complexities. The fact that Agnir was abducted from her birth clan and forcibly adopted as the ward of an enemy clan is deeply messed up. There's a lot to process there and unpack, and the story doesn't shy away from showing how she's struggling to navigate the question of where she truly belongs and where her loyalty should lie. Those are really big questions that are not at all clarified by her feelings for the chieftain's daughter, and in fact are deeply complicated by those feelings. And I really appreciate that the story doesn't posit that uncomfortable dynamic and imbalance of power as being inherently romantic. It's also really powerful to see how the two main characters' feelings for each other unlock a literal kind of power and magic within them. And the same way that their relationship isn't overly romanticized, that magic they manifest together is also not romanticized. This power between them isn't necessarily an answer to their problems in the way they would want. It has very serious implications depending on how they choose to use that magic. So I appreciate the story for living in those gray areas, for reveling in uncertainty, especially in this fantasy world that demands the characters to exist in extremes and absolutes. I really respect what this story has to say about how love is, of course, tremendously powerful, but it's not an answer to all things. And like anything else in this world, it's bound up in its own limitations. I did find myself wanting a bit more from the world building of the story itself, especially in regards to the dynamics between all the splintered clans, but I also wanted a bit more from the structure of the story itself. But I would still give this a solid 4 stars. Lastly, I read my arc of Cinder House by Freya Marski, which comes out on October 7th from Tor.com. This is a queer gothic retelling of the classic Cinderella story. The main character, Ella, is tragically murdered at the age of 16, and now her ghost is trapped in her father's house, and she is invisible to everyone except for her stepmother and stepsisters. So she can't be seen or heard by anyone else around her, and while she can travel a short ways away from the house, she is magically transported back to the staircase where she was killed every night at the stroke of midnight. But one day she strikes a deal with a fairy charm seller that will afford her 3 nights of almost living freedom so she can experience the royal ball for herself. But powerful magic, of course, always comes at a price. Content warnings for descriptions of blood, injury, and death, references to parental loss and grief, depictions of emotional, physical, and verbal abuse, some non-graphic references to domestic violence, sexual harassment, and sexual assault, brief mentions of suicide, and some sexual content. Also worth noting, Ella is attracted to multiple genders, and there's also a polyamorous rep in this story as well. What I appreciate about this novella is that it does present a new and interesting take on the familiar Cinderella story. It is offering something new by transforming a fairy tale into a ghost story, by giving the Cinderella character magical powers that bind her to her childhood house and allow her to personify that house in some ways. In that sense, I do really like how this story is exploring the contours of queerness, again in a way that doesn't center physicality or attraction or identity, but rather explores implausible ways of being and feeling that actively transgress social norms and expectations. Ella's existence as a ghost throws a lot of that into question, because when you can't be seen or heard by anyone, much less felt by anyone, how do you then express intimacy and attraction and closeness? I think the story provides really interesting answers to that question, and related to that, I do also appreciate how the story queers the romantic storyline of the classic Cinderella fairy tale into a relationship with a completely different dynamic. There's also a really strong emotional parallel between Ella and the prince, who are both unable to express themselves to the fullest, or to be seen for what and who they truly are in so many ways. Both of them just want to be seen and accepted and understood, and it's nice that they can give that to each other in ways that the other person wouldn't expect. All of that said, I just think this retelling lacks depth in every respect. It's also overly ambitious in that it introduces characters and ideas that don't always feel relevant or have any kind of lasting impact on the story. And in addition to that, the story tries to incorporate this political struggle between warring countries, but there just isn't enough space or detail given in the story for those ideas to land. I was also hoping for more complexity from the supporting characters, who aren't given a lot of space to truly show themselves in the original fairy tale, especially Ella's stepmom and stepsisters, who are usually never shown to be anything other than violent and vitriolic and abusive. And while this story does attempt to show us those characters from different angles, there's just no depth to them in the end. Everything stays well above the surface. So again, there are a lot of interesting ideas here, lots of refreshing spins on a familiar classic, and clever nods to the source material while still still being able to stand on its own. But even though this might have been my most anticipated of the bunch, I think it sadly falls short of the mark in a lot of ways. In the end, I gave this 3.5 stars. So there you have it. Those are 4 queer novellas coming out in September and October that I have been anticipating all year long. There were definitely some pleasant surprises and really great first-time reading experiences in there that I definitely want to follow up. If you've read any of these yourself, or if you plan to, be sure to stop by the comments down below and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.